Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to our study on the 17 apocalyptic prophecies. Today we're looking at prophecy number 5, which I like to call parallel tales. What we're going to be looking at is a story of kings of the north and the south, all throughout hundreds of years of history, leading to a certain point, which we'll talk about later. There are wars that commence between the north and the south in this period of biblical history and in this prophecy in the book of Daniel, culminating in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, this is a parallel to the second part of this prophecy, in which we are going to learn how the same little horn power that we saw in prophecy 3, Satan, the AntiChrist, appears in the last days as a parallel to all of these previous wars from the first section. And according to this prophecy, God allows him to do this for two major reasons. He grants him this power for two major reasons. Number one, to reveal the extent of sin, what sin looks like in its fullest form when it's given full reign. Really important part of this story, which we'll continue to expound on. And number two, to destroy religious systems, to draw a line in the sand so that God can judge people who are still living in the Great Tribulation. It's about wrapping up the problem of sin, and God needs people not to be sitting on a fence or be in all these different false religious systems, but to decide, am I going to serve the Lord or not? So, it follows then with a third part, kind of an epilogue, which closes out the book of Daniel, because prophecy 5 is the last prophecy from the book of Daniel. The last 12 we're going to move into in the next prophecy, starting in the book of Revelation. So, very exciting. We're going to look at this story here, okay? So starting in this first section, the Bible says, I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will arise in Persia. Now, these kings the Bible's talking about, you can look at from history, are Cambyses, Darius the First, and Berdia. Then a fourth, who is far richer than the other ones, will arise. This is Xerxes. You may remember from the story of Esther. You may also know Xerxes. I don't know if you knew this. Esther's husband, Xerxes, kind of glorified in a romantic sense in the book of Esther, is actually the king of Persia, which attacks Greece. You may know from the movie 300, or the story of this battle of these 300 warriors which stand against the king of Persia. That actually was Xerxes. Then the Bible says, a mighty king will arise who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. You can see from history, this was Alexander the Great and his conquest of the entire known world. The Bible says, after he has arisen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out to the 4 winds of heaven. Remember, we talked about this. It will not go on to his descendants, because it will be uprooted and given to others, his 4 generals. You remember this from prophecy number 2. Also, when we looked at prophecy 3, the goat became very great. His large horn was broken off. In its place, 4 prominent horns grew up, his 4 generals, which we talked about in prophecy 3. We continue to see repetition and enlargement in all of these prophecies. Very important to note. Now, I'm going to give us kind of a pretty cool sequence of animations to reveal what the Bible says about these kings of the north and the south and how they line up with history. We don't have enough time to go through every single verse in this prophecy because it covers a couple of chapters. Very exciting, but I encourage you to go ahead and read that. We're going to read through this first one, and then I'm going to continue with these animations just to reveal to you what happened in these sequences, and I'm going to put the verses beside each part so you can look it up on your own. But check out this story. This little sequence right here to start out. The king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his kingdom with great power. After some years, they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days, she will be betrayed together with her royal escort and her father and the one who supported her. One from her family line will arise to take her place, and he will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortress. He will fight, and he will be victorious. He will also seize their gods, their metal, their valuable articles of gold and silver. He'll carry them off to Egypt. Then the king of the north will invade back again the realm of the king of the south, but will retreat to his own country. So there's like all this stuff happening here. Now, this prophecy doesn't contain symbolic language because God doesn't define the symbols. These are literal things that are happening. So check this out. Now, this is historical here from this point. You have the kings of the north and the south. Alexander the Great from chapter 11, verse 3. We just looked at that. Then as the king of the south started with Ptolemy the first, and in the king of the north, Seleucus the first. Now, Ptolemy had a daughter, Bernice. Seleucus had an heir, Antiochus. Now, Antiochus married Laodice. Check this out. This is super cool. Antiochus divorces his wife, Laodice, in order to marry Bernice. And so an alliance was created between the two. But he then turned away from Bernice, divorced her, and married back to his first wife, Laodice. They both have heirs from both of these relationships. Well, Laodice wasn't too hot on everything that had happened, and she decides to go ham and wipe out all of these heirs, as well as Bernice and Antiochus. Later on, Bernice's brother, Ptolemy III, takes the reign and attacks Seleucus II to avenge Bernice. He's victorious. He plunders the realm of the king of the north. And then later, Seleucus II attacks Ptolemy III. You can see these verses here in yellow. And in order to recover these riches, but he loses and he retreats. So knowing this history, let's read this again and look at the Bible's authority on time. After some years later, they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south, that would be Bernice, will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she will not retain her power. She will be betrayed, and together with her royal escort, her father, and the one who support her, because Laodice wiped them all out. One from her family line, her brother, will arise and attack the forces of the king of the north. He will be victorious. He plunders the silver. He plunders the gold. Then later, the king of the north invades him back again, but will retreat to his own country. How cool is that? Everything that the Bible predicted happened exactly. Now, we can't go through and read every single verse in this chapter, so I'm just going to give you, again, just the historical context of what happens throughout the rest of this chapter. And you can look at these verses, check them out yourself, take screenshots if you're watching the video. Ptolemy IV, Seleucus III, and Antiochus III are both kind of joint heirs. Well, they attack the realm of the south in order to avenge their brother. Later on, the line continues. Ptolemy IV attacks to get revenge, and he's actually victorious. So Antiochus III, he's shamed. He's totally routed, totally defeated. You can see in verse 11 there. So Ptolemy IV, since he wins, he becomes very proud. The Bible says in chapter 11, verse 12, but he dies mysteriously with his wife. Not sure what happened there. In his line follows Ptolemy V. Well, now Antiochus III is like, all right, this guy's wiped out. Now his son is in his place. I'm going to attack him back again. And he's victorious at the Battle of Sidon from chapter 11, verses 13 through 15. The Bible predicted all of this hundreds of years before it happened. Amazing. Later on, Rome invades the kingdom of the north, the kingdom of Greece, and becomes the kind of the reigning power. Julius Caesar is the emperor. His cousin Mark Antony is his general. So Ptolemy XI, this is really interesting. He has these two heirs, and one of them is Cleopatra. Maybe you remember her name from history. Well, she decides to try to form an alliance by seducing Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, but this doesn't work because Julius Caesar is assassinated, Mark Antony also dies, so the alliance falls apart and crumbles, just like Daniel chapter 11, verses 18 and 19 predicted. Octavius, and then later on, through adoption, Tiberius Caesar takes the throne, is the emperor. And this is the emperor that is in place when Jesus is baptized. The Bible says in Luke chapter 3, verse 1, in the 15th year of Tiberius. So that was actually predicted in Daniel 11:22. The Bible says a prince of the covenant will also be killed. And so that was right during the time that was already predicted. Well, this is where things get really interesting because there's a battle, there's a stalemate between the two kingdoms. They sit to make peace, but really they're deceiving one another, the Bible says. Later on, Emperor Nero arises. Daniel chapter 11, verse 28, Israel revolts in AD 66. And so he sends his general, Vespasian, to go and to siege Jerusalem. This is really, really important, really interesting, because the people living at this time actually recognized this in the prophecies before it took place. Nero commits suicide in AD 68, and so Vespasian lifts the siege of Jerusalem. The Bible predicted this in Daniel 11:28. He returns to Rome, and the Christians at this point flee from Jerusalem. Later on, Titus, which was Vespasian's son, attacks the kingdom of the south, but is defeated by an incredible navy of West Africa and Egypt. So in his defeat, on his way back, he decides he's not going home without victory. So he lays siege to Jerusalem again in AD 70, and he's there with a vengeance, the Bible says in Daniel 11:30 through 35. There's total destruction in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is totally destroyed. As Jesus predicted, not one stone of the temple was left on top of another, because they tore it apart in order to harvest the gold and the precious metals that the temple was laced with. 1.1 million people dead and 97,000 approximately carried off as slaves. The Bible predicted all of this before it ever happened. Can we just take a minute to just think about how incredible that is? Just the accuracy and the details with which God predicted all these things, and to recognize between the historical accuracy of prophecy 4 and the 70 weeks, right, which nailed down the exact date of Jesus' death from 457 BC all the way to AD 30, and then now this prophecy with all of its details. The Bible is incredible and is the leading authority on time and on history. And what that does for me, I don't know about for you, but it validates what the Bible says about things that are to come. Here we have kind of a transition between the past and the future, because as Daniel picks up in chapter 11, verse 36, all of a sudden the language changes. There's a shift. There's another king now that rises up, a king who will exalt and magnify himself above every god. And he will say unheard of things against the God of gods, and he will be successful until the time of wrath is completed. So now the time of wrath, we've jumped forward to the end times. From AD 70, now all of a sudden, here we are at the end times. There's a gap here, a jump. And so this is where we start seeing the parallels, as the Bible shows over and over and over again, between the time of Israel in biblical history and the end times. Many parallels between the two. God does this on purpose. He will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Even the Caesars, the emperors, they were in submission to God and to the Pope as an authority in the Holy Roman Empire. This king is going to disregard everything that calls itself God. This is the Antichrist, or Satan. And again, as we look at these things, sometimes I'm just saying things here through these prophecies because they're excerpts of what we'll see in later prophecies. There's repetition, there's enlargement, and we're going to see these things unfold as we continue to move through these prophecies in the book of Revelation with even more and more specifics. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him. Essentially, he's going to sweep over him like a flood. And what happens here in Israel was locked between the north and the south, and then the Mediterranean Sea was blocking them in on the side. So all of these wars and battles that were happening throughout Israel's history, they were caught in the middle. And so what's going to happen in the end times, as the Bible predicts, disaster always comes from the north, the Bible says. And so the enemies of Israel, the enemies of God's people, in this case in the end times, Lucifer, Satan himself, is going to basically wage war on the entire world. And anyone that does not submit to his authority is going to be routed. He's going to attack viciously, fiercely, sweep through like a flood. And so God's people are going to be caught in the middle of that battle between Lucifer and essentially the non-religious wicked that refuse to come under his authority. He will also invade the beautiful land. This is referring to Israel, God's chosen people, his special possession, the land of Canaan. Many countries will fall, but this is interesting. Edom and Moab and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. You have to know a little bit of biblical history. This is analogous language that's being used here, because in the time of Israel's destruction, when Nebuchadnezzar came in and laid siege to Israel and took all the Jews off, including Daniel himself, some of the Israelites fled to these lands of Edom and Moab. And King Ammon, a lot of people were protected under his authority when they left Jerusalem, when they fled King Nebuchadnezzar's attack and his siege. So what it's saying here is not every person, not every Christian is going to be destroyed or killed by Lucifer, but some are actually going to survive through the entire tribulation. I don't know if that's good or bad, because they'll probably be kind of on their last leg by the end of this, but we'll get to that. Reports from the east and the north will alarm him. The east is the direction from which Jesus appears, the Bible says, at the end of time. And so these reports that are coming in are, I believe, the messages of the 144,000 God's prophets. Again, we'll get to all of this as we continue to unfold these prophecies, but so many of them link together, so I just have to share that with you. The Bible says that there's 3 angels' messages that come through God's prophets, the 144,000. And this news, these reports, he is not going to like, because he sets himself up against the God of gods. So he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. There's so much to be said about this. We just don't have time to get into all of it. I just want to stick to the contents of this prophecy, and more will unfold as we continue to develop on these things. So then Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. I really encourage you to do a study on who Michael is in the Bible, who the angel of the Lord is in the Bible. It's kind of outside the context of this particular prophecy and what we're trying to establish here, but very important nonetheless. And I think what you will see when you look at this is that Michael is a representation of Jesus himself as our high priest, the great prince who protects his people, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, of Israel. Not to say that Jesus is an angel by any means, but as he took the form of a human being, I think the Bible's pretty clear that he also takes the form of an angel, God in human form, God in angelic form, in order to reveal himself to his creation. And so what this is talking about, you have to understand, again, how many times have we said this in this series? You have to understand temple language. If you don't understand the temple system, if you say that's old, that's irrelevant, that doesn't matter to me, you're never going to understand Bible prophecy, because Bible prophecy uses temple language. Even right here, what is happening during the Day of Atonement? We referenced this a little bit in some of the prophecies past, that God is cleansing heaven's temple. Again, go and watch the series in the Foundation series. It's called God Has a Courtroom, and you'll see this more clearly. And the Day of Atonement, heaven's temple, the earthly temple, is just a copy, just a shadow of the one in heaven. The high priest goes through and he stands at each altar. And so he's ministering there, cleansing the guilt that has been assigned, the blood that has passed onto each altar throughout the year. And when he's done, he rises up from that place and continues to move outward out of the temple. So when you understand that, you see that Michael is arising from the place in the temple where he's standing. That's because Jesus is moving away as our high priest from the ministry at the altar of incense, and he's moving out to his ministry at the altar of burnt offering. This sparks the start of the Great Tribulation. Remember, we talked about the heaven-earth linkage law. When something is happening in heaven's temple, something happens here on earth. God gives us that so that we understand. So then he says there will be a time of distress. What's happening in heaven? What's happening on earth? Such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until now. So I'm going to throw this chart up here. I know this is a lot. You can pause the video, put an overlay on here so you can look at this. And also there's charts here for you and charts for you to download online as well. This is the prophecy that we just looked at. You can see here the kings of the north and the south, right in the time of the 70 weeks from prophecy 4. Here's what I was illustrating about the kings of the north, the kings of the south. Israel's caught in the middle. That's what's going to happen in the end times. Lucifer, the king of the north, the saints are caught in the middle between him and the opposition to Lucifer from the non-religious people. We're going to see a lot more of this, a lot more specifics, validation from this as we continue to look at the prophecies from Revelation. The Great Tribulation, and then there's the second coming and the resurrection of the dead, which, man, cannot wait for that. From here, we see just an epilogue in this prophecy, Daniel chapter 12. I'm going to kind of read through this as we close out today. But you, Daniel, roll up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. So Daniel looks, and there before him is standing 2 others, one on this bank of the river and one on the opposite bank. These are holy ones speaking back and forth. And one says to the other, "How long will it be before these astounding, astonishing things are fulfilled?" So Daniel gets a time period. It will be for a time, times, and half a time. We've seen this previously in previous prophecies, 1,260 years. Well, in this case, 1260 days, and I'm going to get to that when we look at Rule 4 here in a minute. I heard, but I did not understand. So I asked, my Lord, what will the outcome of all of this be? Well, basically, God says, Hakuna Matata, no worries, don't worry about it. This is not for you. This is for a later generation. He says, because the words are rolled up and sealed till the time of the end. Daniel, go your own way. Don't worry about it. He says, in the time of the end, those who are wise will understand. And here you are, watching the videos here at this series, studying these things. We want to be wise men of our generation. I didn't mention in Prophecy 4, but the prophecy on the 70 weeks was how the wise men found Jesus in the first place. Israel didn't even know that Jesus was being born, yet 3 wise men from the Orient, from the East, were there for Christ, the coming of the Messiah. How does that happen? They were wise men of their generation, and I hope that you and I are as well for our time. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished, this is really important. You see more temple language here. From the time the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1290 days. The daily sacrifice is the ministry of Jesus in the temple. And so when he stands up and moves away from the altar of incense, we see the start of the Great Tribulation until the time the abomination that causes desolation is set up. You're going to see this later in the book of Revelation to be a universal death decree from Lucifer himself to kill all of God's saints. And the Bible's saying, this is kind of a difficult translation here in the NIV, but if you look at Young's literal translation, you see it a little bit more clearly. From the time of the turning aside of the perpetual, meaning the sacrifice, to the giving out of the abomination that causes desolation, there are 1290 days. So what this is saying is that on the 1290th day of the tribulation is when this death decree is going to come. God has already foretold it. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1335 days. So God is referencing here the length of the tribulation itself. So he's given us a lot of time periods here in this last prophecy in Daniel so we can understand how the tribulation actually fits in. And he leaves Daniel with this beautiful promise, the last verse here. As for you, go your way till the end. You will rest, and at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. How cool is that? Daniel's gone through this struggle, poor guy, over and over. We see week after week, prophecy after prophecy. I lay sick for 3 days. I couldn't do anything. I said, Lord, what does this mean? Don't worry about it, Daniel. I couldn't figure it out. And I went back to the king's court, but I was so disturbed. Over and over, we see all this stuff. Daniel's going to rise to receive his inheritance. Let's look at the 4 rules as we wrap up today. Number 1, sequence. We're getting familiar with these. There's wars that commence between the north and the south. Jerusalem is then destroyed. Jesus' intercession at the altar of incense ceases. Satan appears at the time of the end. That's the 5th trumpet. Number 5, Satan gives out a death decree for Christians. And number 6, Satan is thwarted and God's people are saved in the end. That's the sequence of this prophecy. So we know that it hasn't necessarily been fulfilled yet. Some parts have, but the entire prophecy has not. But God has locked down the fulfillment of this prophecy using precise historical events that we can look back at and validate everything that he said. Jerusalem was destroyed as predicted in AD 70, and now we are awaiting the coming of the Great Tribulation and the coming of Lucifer, Satan himself, during that tribulation. Language, we see in this prophecy, there is not any real symbolic language because the Bible doesn't give any symbolic interpretations. So we see literal language, actual wars that are taking place, just like the Bible says. And we see analogous language, like the stuff that's referencing the temple and the sacrificial system and all of that, analogies, analogous language that's being used. And then lastly, the rule of time, the presence or absence of the Jubilee calendar, which started when God said this is your first day of your first month of your first year in the Exodus, 1437 BC, going all the way 7 sets of 490 years to AD 1994. Any time periods that the Bible gives during that calendar are considered a day for a year. But anything that happens outside of that calendar is not a day for a year. A day is just an actual day. So since the events that are given in this prophecy are relating to the Great Tribulation, the time of the end, which is after this calendar is concluded, we see that they are a day for a day. So when the Bible says a time, times, and half a time in this prophecy, we see why it's days versus the one where it was talking about the Dark Ages in the reign of the Catholic Church, which was years because it was during this calendar. There are 3 time periods related to the time of the end in this prophecy. Number 1, 1,260 days, a time, times, and half a time, which is the time until the temple is going to be cleansed, the time until every decision has been made, left or right, sheep or goats. The 1,290 days, that comes until Satan's universal death decree, when he calls for the destruction of all of God's people. And then 1,335 days, which the Bible says is the total length of time of the Great Tribulation. So these are the 4 rules. Thanks for hanging in there. I know we're rolling through these prophecies, but I really encourage you to pause the video, go back, look at some of these charts, consider some of these things. And that is prophecy 5, the parallel tales, the kings of the north and the south, Lucifer himself, Satan, and then the epilogue from Daniel chapter 10, verse 1 through the end of the book of Daniel. And I hope you'll join us next time for our study on the 17 apocalyptic prophecies as we begin the book of Revelation with prophecy 6. See you then.